Okay. Good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of SR Fatehpuria College, I welcome you for today's session of our 3-day international webinar titled Gender, Sexuality and Post-Colonial Literature, Trends, Issues and Perspectives, organized by the Department of English in collaboration with IQAC of our college. Today, we have 3 lectures. Today's speakers are Professor Niladri R. Chatterjee from the University of Kolani, Professor Dr. Shreya Bhattacharji from the Central University of Jharkhand, and Professor Dr. Isra Santeshu from the University of Georgia, USA. So, without taking more time, I would like to introduce today's first speaker, Professor Niladri R. Chatterjee, and it is my honor and privilege to welcome him. And before handing the mic to him, I would like to tell about him briefly. Dr. Niladri R. Chatterjee is a professor in the Department of English, University of Kalani, Nadia, West Bengal. He has a teaching career for over 25 years, and he has published widely and has been invited to numerous conferences in India as also as on other countries. His doctoral work was on the novelist Christopher Isherwood, a recipient of Fulbright Scholarship and the British Council Charles Wallace Fellowship. He co-edited the Muffled Herd Stories from the Disempowered Male. Recently, he published his first novel, The Scholar. Today, he is going to deliver a lecture on Krishna Gopal Mollik's Buho Probesh, and the title of his lecture is Growing Up Queer, Krishna Gopal Mollik's Buho Probesh. Now, I like to request Professor Niladri sir to begin his lecture. Now it's to you, sir. Please, you can begin the lecture.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks also go to the college for inviting me to speak. Am I audible? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir. You are perfectly audible, sir.
Thank you. So what I really wish to talk about today is a novel that was published in a little known magazine, a Bengali little magazine called Hawa Unoponchash. And this was published in May 1993. This is a novel by Krishna Gopal Mollik, which was originally published in this particular little magazine. And a little bit about Krishna Gopal Mollik first, I think, because many of us may not be aware of him. Now, Krishna Gopal Mollik was very much a part of a certain Bengali literary circle. He lived all his life in North Calcutta on College Street, overlooking College Square. And he is also very, very he was very much engaged with the publication of little magazines. So he himself published a lot of little magazines. And his career is very strange because he also, before he got into publishing little magazines, he was also working in The Statesman. So he worked in the newspaper The Statesman. Of course, in those days, Statesman only had an English edition. The Bengali edition, of course, is very, very new. So Krishna Gopal Mollik worked at the Statesman House for a long time. And then, of course, eventually he decided that he is not going to be a journalist anymore. He is going to take up creative writing, and he would actually encourage the publication of little magazines. And what results is that he publishes a lot of short stories that are published in many of the little magazines that he himself publishes. Some of them have subsequently been collected and published as a volume. And what we really see in these short stories is something that I think is fairly rare in Bengali literature, which is a certain almost uninhibited unapologetic, a very sort of no holds barred, as it were, celebration of sexual awakening. But of course, sexual awakening over here is specifically a homosexual awakening. So it seems to me to be quite extraordinary that when we talk about the presence of queerness in Bengali literature, we don't have much to go by. So there is, of course, the very, very well-known novel Holde Golap. Then, of course, some of us may also be aware of Hashuli Bakir Upakatha. Then, of course, there are these other novels that may have been written. As far as lesbian narratives are concerned, one can certainly talk about the work of Tilottoma Majumdar. But also, I think that there needs to be now, I think, a focus on Krishna Gopal Mollik, because I think that he is somebody who really deserves a lot of attention than has been given to him so far. Why is it that I think Krishna Gopal Mollik is so important? I think Krishna Gopal Mollik is important for the very simple reason that he is talking about sexuality in a way which is not the kind of discourse which is acceptable to patriarchy. Now, if we actually look at the whole trajectory of LGBT literature, as it were, not necessarily in the context of Bengal, but if you look at the trajectory of LGBT literature across the world, initially, that is to say in the 20th century or in the 19th century, much of the literature from the LGBT community was very strongly geared towards garnering sympathy. So there was always this idea that, please take pity on us, or please try to understand that we are suffering, that we are in pain, that our lives are miserable. So therefore, there was a way in which somehow unhappiness and misery and sadness were made a very important part of these narratives in order to garner sympathy, not necessarily empathy, sympathy to begin with, from the heteronormative readership. So there was also, there would also be, sort of literature where the person is saying, oh, I'm so sorry that I'm like this, I understand that I'm diseased. I understand that, I'm, this is an illness, but what can I do? It is an illness that I was born with. So there is that kind of sense of helplessness, which is a very important part of initially the way in which queer writing develops. Yes. Not all the time, because even as early as 1911, I'm not terribly sure about before that, but certainly in 1911, you had the French writer who subsequently went on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, André Gide. You have André Gide, who is publishing a pamphlet, well, actually, a book of nonfiction called Corridon. And in Corridon, that book is essentially an exercise at sort of, presenting to the public homosexuality as not something that is unnatural, as not something that is a disease. It is presented, or the attempt is made to present it as something that is natural, something that is normal. So that kind of an effort was happening in 1911. But of course, you must understand that André Gide himself does not publish his book in 1911. Well, he publishes a very, very limited edition of that book. Only he prints about 12 copies, which is not available to the public. And then much later, he returns to that book. And in 1920, he publishes that book again, actually 1922. And then, of course, it goes into several reprints, and he publishes it in 1925. And of course, it continues to be reprinted until we come to 1947, which is the edition that I have in my collection, right? So there are people like André Gide who are talking about homosexuality, and they are saying that please do not regard this as something abnormal. This is nothing unnatural. This is something that is natural. That kind of an effort is happening around the 1920s. Also, in 19th century Germany, you also have the figure of Magnus Hirschfeld, who is also setting up his Museum of Sexual Science, where he is actively campaigning for the decriminalization of homosexuality, decriminalization of gayness. So therefore, there is a way in which in the late 19th century, early 20th century, a kind of movement is beginning to build up where people are beginning to talk about sexual rights of homosexual men specifically. And by the time we come to the 1920s, 30s, more and more of literature begins to be generated. And of course, as you very well know, that by the time we come to the 1960s, it becomes a very, very pressing concern. Homosexuality between adults, consenting adults in private, is actually decriminalized in 1967 in England. And of course, the world's first Pride March happens in 1970. Okay, now that is broadly the international timeline. Now, what we really have to understand is the way in which this little boy, who incidentally is also called Krishna Gopal. So in the novel, Krishna Gopal is basic. It's very difficult to understand whether this is an example of autobiography or whether this is fiction or whether this is faction. That is to say, fact and fiction, because it is written in a very, very sort of almost autobiographical tone of voice. The narrator is a first-person singular narrative, so it is always I. And what we find is that this little boy, growing up in North Calcutta, is gradually beginning to understand what is sexuality. He is beginning to understand, the pleasures of masturbation. He is beginning to understand the pleasure of groping girls. So yes, there is that too. So there is an incident where he is actually groping this female friend, this little girl that he plays with. So there are all these experimentations that are happening into masturbation, into groping. The idea of consent is never really occurring to him. And so we find this person talking about his experimentations with sexuality, as it were. But what is remarkable is the fact that there is no sense of guilt here. There is no sense of pain. There's no trauma. It is narrated in this almost sort of like childlike quality, which is remarkable considering that Krishna Gopal Mullik is actually writing the novel in 1993, when he is quite mature in age, and when he has already been married, he's got children. So he's absolutely a married man with children, writing about his homosexuality in this incredibly autobiographical novel. Now, what I really wish to do is I am going to try and situate the novel Buho Probesh in the context that Krishna Gopal Mullik is circulating in, and also in the context in which Krishna Gopal Mullik is educating himself. Now, what you really have to understand is that Krishna Gopal Mullik, and there are many examples of it in the novel, that he is very interested in the outside world. If there is one particular motif that I have to talk about in the novel, I think the motif has to be exploration. He's exploring everything. He is exploring the city. So he is taking the tram. As many of you who are familiar with Calcutta, you will know that there is a tram track that runs along what used to be called Cornwallis Street and later on became Bidhan Sarani. Krishna Gopal Mullik, it is a thrill for him to get on and get off trams. He goes for long walks. He is exploring, as it were, the geography of the city. he is also exploring the world because the family gets picture magazines. So he is actually getting to, he's becoming aware of world events. He's becoming aware of what is happening internationally. He remember that he's growing up sometime in the late 40s, early 50s. The novel actually ends in 1951. So he is actually looking at the world of the late 1940s, and he is looking at what's going on outside the world. He is looking at these sort of news magazines where he's getting to see pictures of news events that are happening across the world. Also, he's also being inspired by one of his relatives to take an interest in stamps. So he's also amassing, he's not amassing his stamp collection, one of his relatives amasses stamp collection. So in addition to having a stamp collection, he is also being introduced to the world of shortwave radio. So therefore he has this relative. Remember that the Mollik family is living, this is very much an old-fashioned joint family. So there are many people who are living in this house. And it is one of those relatives through which he actually learns about shortwave radio. So he can hear radio stations that are coming from other countries. He is also reading English literature. He is also reading David Copperfield, for example. So there is a way in which Krishna Gopal Mollik's sort of intellectual upbringing is a fairly expansive one. It is not in any way restricted to just Bengal or just Kolkata. So therefore, exploration and curiosity and interest in the world outside is a very important part of how the novel actually takes shape. What I shall do occasionally is also read out certain
Extremely sorry for the technical glitches. Perhaps a call has come in Sir's phone, so he will be back soon. Wait a bit. Extremely sorry, due to some network problem, the sir had just left the meeting and he will join us very soon. Just wait a bit. Okay, the sir has joined, and sir, please begin the lecture. Okay, sir.
Right. Can everybody see me and hear me? Okay. I already begun my lecture. So did you not hear everything that I said before?
No, sir. No, absolutely no, sir. Actually, we have you got disconnected just
did everybody
one
hear
or
what
two,
I said before?
Just 1 minute ago, sir.
Right. So did you hear everything that I said before I got disconnected?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir.
Okay, thank you. Because you said begin the lecture, so I was a little worried because I can't begin from the beginning anymore. Okay. So what I really wish to do is talk about this extraordinary experience that he has. He goes to a neighbor. He goes to a shop in the neighborhood to collect subscription. And this is the description that is given. রাস্তার দিকটা একটু দেখে নিয়ে উঁচু সিন্দুকটার পেছনে চলে যাই, দেওয়ালের দিকে মুখ করে দাঁড়িয়ে পড়ি হাফ প্যান্ট হাতে নিয়ে, দোকানের লোহার গড়াদের দরজাটা ভেজিয়ে দিয়ে Poddar, this is the gentleman to whom he has gone for subscription. পোদ্দার সিন্ধুকের পেছনে চলে আসে, মাথা উঁচু করে রাস্তা আর দোকানের দরজায় নজর রাখতে রাখতে জাপটাতে থাকে। তবে মিনিট তিন চারেক বেশি নয়। মুখে উস আস উস আওয়াজ করে ঠেকাতে না ঠেকাতেই টের পাই আমার উড়ুতে পায়ের ডিমে টপ টপ করে পড়ছে। চুপচাপ দাঁড়িয়েই থাকি। পোদ্দার তার গামছা দিয়ে ঘষে ঘষে মুছে দেয়। আরো আছে। কোথায় রে মল্লিক? নিচের দিকে। ঠিক আছে, দিচ্ছি। নিচু হয়ে দু পায়ের পাতা অবধি দুবার মুছে দেয়। প্যান্ট পরে নিয়ে পোদ্দারের আড়ালে আড়ালে বাইরে চলে আসি। খুচরো পয়সা রাখার কেঠো থেকে একটা 2 আনি তুলে আমার হাতে দিলে আমি যত্ন করে পোদ্দারের নামে একটা বিল কেটে দিই। তারপর হাত পাতি। রূপো দিন, চাঁদি নিবি? কি করবি? বোনের কানের মাকড়ি করাবি? বোনকে নিয়ে আসিস একদিন, অনেক রূপো দেব, সোনাভি দিব। And the reason why I read out that extraordinary section is because, do you see that you have this little boy who has just been used sexually by a man, but the boy who does that narration does so without any sense of guilt or shame or oh my god, what happened to me, I'm traumatized. The whole description is extremely matter of fact. And it is this matter of fact, as if, the whole description of the way in which Poddar basically uses him sexually, there is no sense that this is anything out of the ordinary. And it is this absolute ordinariness of this description which I think is extraordinary. That is the main point that I'm trying to make, is that it is done in the sense of, yes, well, of course, this happens all the time. It is this ordinariness which I think is so extraordinary. Now we move on, therefore, to the way in which he gradually begins to acquire a sense of identity. He reads a lot. He also talks about the Hindu-Muslim riots. So there are many sort of references that are embedded in the text, which gives it a certain historical resonance. He is extremely aware of the world. As I told you, he also starts to experiment with masturbation. He also understands that he also overhears his parents having sex. And also that is something which he registers. So he knows that there is something that is going on between his parents that can only be done in the dark, that can only be done furtively. So that is a sense that he also has. So by the time we come to the way in which he begins to explore his sexuality, one really has to understand that he becomes more and more interested in what is happening to his body. He is more and more intrigued by what exactly is the sexual that goes on. And over here, he also notices animals copulating. So there is also the sense in which he says, ঠিক তখনই মুরগির ডানা পালক কাড়াকাড়ি করতে করতে কুকুর দুটো ওইখানে হাজির। খানিকক্ষণ কামড়াকামড়ি করার পরই দেখি ওইসব ছেড়ে দিয়ে মদ্দা কুকুরটা মাদি কুকুরের পিঠে উঠে পড়েছে। মাদিটা সরে গেলেও মদ্দাটা ঝাঁপিয়ে গিয়ে পেছন থেকে তার পিঠে চড়ে পড়ছে। আর ঠিক তখনই মদ্দাটার ননি থেকে দগদগে লাল শক্ত মতন একটা বেরিয়ে আসছে, আর সেইটা মাদিটার পেছনে ঠেলে ঠেলে গুঁজে দিচ্ছে। এইরকম একটা দগদগে লাল বেরিয়ে পড়ে দেখেছি বিমলদের বাঘের মতন মস্ত অ্যালসেন্টারও, সেটার ননিটা আমার ডবল। Look at the way in which sort of the penis of dogs are being looked at with a great deal of interest by this child who is exploring just the sheer sort of power, the charge of sexuality, without, again, any kind of shame, without any kind of guilt. He's just fascinated by the way in which sexuality is revealing itself to him. And I think this is something which it continues to happen for a very, very long time. And this is also the time when he starts to not so much appreciate, but he also starts to register the nudity of other boys. And that is something that happens very, very, again, almost with a lack of total self-consciousness. So we constantly see, there is this description, for example, where he says, একদিন বিকেলে গোলদিঘিতে বাজি ধরে সবাইকার সামনে ও ন্যাংটা হয়ে জলে নেমে পড়লো, ব্যাস বাজি জিতেই বাজি জেতাই ওর কাল হলো। সেদিন তো প্যান্ট ছাড়াই ওকে ঝাড়া আধ ঘন্টা সামনে পেছনে হাত চাপা দিয়ে আমাদের ওর পেছনে আড়ালে লুকিয়ে থাকতে হলো। দে ভাই প্যান্টটা দিয়ে দে ভাই বলে বলে। তাছাড়াও যখন তখন দল বেঁধে ওকে যেখানে সেখানে ন্যাংটা করে দেওয়া চলছে। কারো সঙ্গে গন্ডগোল বেশি হলেই অমনি শুরু হয়ে যায় এখন দে তো ওকে মদনা করে দে তো। So therefore there are boys who are registering the nudity of other boys, and that is also sort of becoming a kind of exploration of sexuality as well. There is a fairly large description of the way in which he is actually sodomized, and that the whole description of sodomy is also done without any sense of blaming the person who is doing the sodomizing. It does not even occur to him that if you are going to have sex with someone, that consent is very important. In the entire novel, there is absolutely no sense that consent is necessary at all. So what we really have to understand, that by the time he begins to explore his own city, by the way in which he begins to explore his sexuality, he is also at the same time acquiring a sense of gender. And that sense of gender, the fact that he is a man, is something that is, of course, drummed into him, not only by the culture around him, but also is being drummed into him at his school. And this is the part which I think is rather extraordinary, because he says over here, আমার ভালো লাগার অ্যাডিশনাল কিন্তু নিতে পারা গেল না। ক্লাস 9-এ যখন অ্যাডিশনাল কে কি নেবে ঠিক হলো, তখন আমি চেয়েছিলাম ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ। So he wanted to take up language as his additional subject, কিন্তু মাস্টার মশাইরা তেরে এলেন, ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজে তোমার নম্বর উঠবে, ম্যাথমেটিক্স নাও, ওতে তো নম্বর না হলে পার্সেন্টেজ বাড়বে কি করে। আমি ম্যাথমেটিক্সই নিয়েছি, উল্টে পাল্টে দেখেওছি, কিন্তু ওসব ফার্ডস আমার ভালো লাগছে না। তবে কস থিটা ট্যান থিটায় মজা আছে মনে হচ্ছে। সত্যানন্দ বাবু, চিত্ত বাবু, স্যারেরা বারবার বলছেন অঙ্কই প্রধান অস্ত্র, শানাও শানাও। So there is a way in which look at the language that is being used. The teachers are actually saying that mathematics is the main weapon. You have to sharpen it. So the language that is being invoked is clearly the language that is martial, weapon, sharpen it, language of war, language of battlefield, and therefore by extension language of masculinity. So the way in which language is still being used, although he couldn't take his favorite additional language, but the way the teachers are telling him অঙ্কই প্রধান অস্ত্র, শানাও শানাও, is very much the way in which he's being told this is a fit subject for boys. This is a fit subject for men. This is the prime weapon. You have to sharpen it. And this continues, of course, his exploration of masculinity also teaches him that masculinity is also about competition. So it is about war, it is about battle, it is about competition too. Assistant headmaster মশাই ঈশান বাবু একদিন ডেকে বললেন, তুমি সিরিয়াসলি শুরু করে দিয়েছো তো? শুধু ইন্টেলিজেন্স দিয়ে হয় না, তার সঙ্গে চাই ডিলিজেন্স, হার্ড লেবার, তবেই যদি হয়। দেখো বাবু, তুমি জ্যোতির্ময়কে কোনো দিনই আর টপকাতে পারবে না। ও তোমার নাগালের বাইরে এগিয়ে গেছে। কিন্তু মনে রেখো, মানিক বড়াল তোমায় তোমার গায়ে গায়ে লেগে তুমি একটু ঢিলে মারলেই ও তোমাকে টপকে যাবে। আর তাছাড়া তুষার বলে নতুন ছেলেটি খুব ভালো রেজাল্ট নিয়ে এসেছে, ওকেও সাবধান। So there is a way in which the teachers, arguably all male, are very carefully drumming into him the idea that to be a man is to learn how to fight, to learn how to compete, and to learn how to win. So there is a way in which, without actually naming it, a certain kind of masculinity is being constructed by his school teachers, fairly rigorously. And that, I think, is basically where we gradually come to see a different point of him, that while the teachers are telling him about competition, he is, of course, developing in a slightly different way. His much, much more greater preoccupation is in creative writing. And it is in creative writing that he gradually begins to assert himself. He gradually begins to assert his creative diligence. He starts to write a novel, and also we first come to know about the ways in which he is experimenting with non-normativity. What it is like to be able to transgress. What is it like to be able to basically break the rules? So there are certain non-normativities that, and this is a particularly interesting passage, যদি উড়ে যাওয়া যেত তাহলে আমাদের বাড়ির ওপর ছাদ থেকে উড়ে মোটামুটি সোজা দক্ষিণে গেলে মানিকদের বাড়ির ছাদে নামা যায়। কিন্তু বড় রাস্তা দিয়ে যেতে গেলে বেশ ঘুরে যেতে হয়। শর্টকাট অবশ্য একটা আছে, কিন্তু সে রাস্তায় আমাদের বারণ। কে যে কবে বারণটা করেছিল ঠিক ধরতে পারি না, তবে আমরা সবাই জানি ও রাস্তায় যাওয়া আমাদের উচিত নয়। কিন্তু তাড়াতাড়ির মাথায় একদিন দুপুরের দিকে ওই রাস্তা দিয়েই আমার সঙ্গে মানিককে বাড়ি ফিরতে হলো। Obviously we know what rasta this refers to. This of course is the part where it is the red light district. This is where the sex workers live. So therefore there are prohibitions that are also being marked out for this little boy. He is being told that there are certain lanes that should be avoided. He's not told why, but of course it does not take him long to actually discover what exactly is going on there. Gonika mane ami jani. So this is where he is beginning to understand. He's grappling with the idea of the sex worker. Gonika mane ami jani. Class 7-এই দারিকা একদিন তার পড়বার ঘরের দরজা বন্ধ করে বিশদ বঙ্গীয় অভিধান থেকে একে একে দেখিয়েছিল গণিকা, নিতম্ব, শিষ্ণু, পায়ু এবং আরো অনেক ওই রকম। ভগর মানে দেখে খুব অবাক লেগেছিল আমার। তাহলে কি ভগবান মেয়ে ছেলে? জানি তো ভগ প্লাস আছে অর্থে বতুপতপ্রায় করে ভগবান হয়, প্রাত্যয় করে ভগবান হয়। ভগবানের এই গোলমালটা এখনো কাটেনি। স্যারেদের জিজ্ঞেস করা যায় না, আশা করছি বড় হলে বুঝে যাব। So he is already beginning to understand that if bhogo means vagina, then is Bhagavan therefore woman? So did you realize that even as a young boy, he's actually beginning to question words. He is beginning to question language. So he's already developing a kind of awareness that this is something which really needs to be explored, or something that should be explored. He, of course, starts writing fiction, and of course, gradually, what begins to happen is that he falls in love with this young boy who is 1 or 2 years younger than him. And eventually, when the novel comes to an end, we find that these two boys finally establish sexual contact with each other, and it basically happens through this novel that he has written. He reads out the novel, and the other boy expresses his dissatisfaction, and he suddenly says over here, হঠাৎ ও আমায় ছেড়ে দিয়ে পটাপট করে বোতাম খুলে নিজের শার্টটা ছুঁড়ে ফেলে দিল, ফাঁস না খুলে টেনে দড়ি ছিঁড়ে পায়জামাটা নামিয়ে পা দিয়ে সরিয়ে দিল, আর সর্বাঙ্গ দিয়ে আমায় জড়িয়ে ধরে ম্যালেরিয়ার কাঁপুনিতে বলে উঠল, আমায় নাও নাও গোপাল, আমায় তোমার আপন করে নাও, আমার সব তুমি নাও, নাও আমার নাও, পারবে তুমি এটাও লিখে দিতে, পারবে না তুমি সব কিছু লিখতে, পারবে না তুমি তোমার আমার নাম দিয়েই এই সমস্ত কিছু একটুও না লুকিয়ে উজাড় করে লিখে দিতে, পারবে না তুমি? So there are a couple of more paragraphs after which the novel ends, but isn't it interesting that even when there is a very, very strong sort of metafictional quality to it, because even as he's talking about this boy telling the narrator, won't you ever be able to write about us without any kind of inhibition? And when we read the novel, we realize that is exactly what is happening. He is writing about it without any inhibition. I will actually end my presentation over here by basically saying that what Krishna Gopal Mollik manages to accomplish rather deftly is creating a kind of queer fiction which can be read as some kind of a Bildungsroman, because he's actually he's coming of age, as it were, not coming of age in the sense that he's turning 21, because when the novel ends, he has just turned 16. But there is a kind of sexual awakening. Now, in most cases in Bengali literature, when we talk about sexual awakening, it is almost always the heterosexual awakening that is being talked about. I think that this particular novel is rather remarkable, because coming as it is, and remember, it is also set in the post-colonial period, right? So therefore, this is happening after India's independence. India has become independent. Now, this is happening in the early 50s. India has just become independent, as it were. We are still living in Nehruvian India. And in the Nehruvian India, where there is a certain national project of creating the Nehruvian Indian man, I would refer you to the essay by Sanjay Srivastava, where he talks about the 5-year plan hero. So while that kind of a construction of masculinity is happening at the national level, here in Kolkata, at local level, you have this little boy who is going to school, who is experimenting with his sexuality in a way in which he does not have a roadmap to do. It is interesting that he talks about David Copperfield, but he does not mention the very peculiar relationship between David Copperfield and Steerforth. That is not done. So there is a very interesting way in which he is becoming aware of literature, of world culture, of other nations, and yet he is beginning to fashion out for himself a kind of sexuality that he does not see being reflected anywhere. But this lack of reflection of homosexuality does not induce any feeling of guilt, any feeling of shame. He still finds it celebratory. Thank you so much.
The course that has been posted by listeners in YouTube. I have just if you wish, you can see it by yourself, or I can read out.
Why don't
in
you
the
read
chat
out
box?
the questions? I
Okay, sir.
can
Okay,
see.
sir.
Let me see if I can.
Okay, now
Right.
I
Okay.
request the audiences if they have any questions or observations regarding today's lecture, then they can certainly put in the chat box. They can certainly write in the YouTube chat box, and we will try to pass them to our respected sir. Okay. And sir, there are
Yes.
two questions that has already I have posted. Just take on it.
Right. Thank you so much. So, thank you so much for your question, Uma Rai Sridevasan. One may compare with Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, a similar situation with a different response. Quite. It is interesting that God of Small Things, of course, comes out in 1997. So it comes out 5 years after this novel is published. But you're absolutely right that no text functions in isolation. Every text is part of a bigger network, and I think that I'm sure that if you do more reading, you are going to come across many such instances where sort of pubescent adolescent sexuality is being explored. But of course, I understand that in God of Small Things, ultimately it ends in tragedy. I mean, it's ultimately a tragic novel. But of course, over here, it has a happy ending. And I think the fact that this is happening in 1993, remember that this is also happening 6 years before India's first Pride Walk takes place in Kolkata, which happens in 1999. But it is not as though there is no coverage of homosexuality in the Indian press, because in 1992, there is already a demonstration for sort of homosexual rights, a very nascent one in Delhi. So there is some very little coverage of homosexuality that is happening. I am pretty certain that since Krishna Gopal Mollik was working in the Statesman, it is highly unlikely that he wasn't aware of these developments, but of course they don't come into the fiction at all. So yes, please, you can certainly make these connections. I think they'll be very interesting. Bonosmita Kalita, sir, do you think the boy narrator was able to challenge gender stereotype? He actually, it's very interesting. He does not actually try to challenge gender stereotype at all. I don't think he actually thinks about gender very much. It is not it's simply something that it doesn't occur to him at all. He is simply fascinated by sexuality. He just thinks sexuality is an amazing thing. And he explores sexuality. He enjoys his body the way in which he had never done before. Yes, there are certain there is a certain gendering that certainly happens over here, because there is a very small part where he and this other girl that he plays with, they start to play house. So they say, oh, I'm the husband and you'll be the wife, and I'll come from office and you'll do the cooking. So there is some kind of a training in gender that is happening through, as it were, child's play, but that occupies a very small part of the narrative. Most of it is about the exploration of sexuality. Amita Mondol, sir, why is it called queer when it talks that having different sexual orientation is normal and natural? Okay, this is something that I have just been talking about in the morning as well. Amita, what you must know is that from 1990 onwards, there is a new meaning that has begun to be applied to the term queer. Queer in the 90s has come to mean a politics. Yes, it has also come to mean a political position. It has also come to mean a kind of reading. So therefore, if you are queer or if you are queering, what you are basically doing is you are opposing normativity. That is to say, you are opposing all the ways in which society tells you this is normal, this is abnormal, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. So all these normativities, all these creations of what is normal, the political position of the queer, it opposes that, right? So therefore, to claim to be queer or to do the act of queering is a kind of very progressive feminist anti-patriarchal politics. So queer has changed its meaning in the academic context, in the context of gender studies. Queer is a good thing. It means that you are opposing patriarchy, you are opposing gender binary, you are opposing, the way in which patriarchy works. Onjit Dev Sharma says, sir, I do not find anything about Krishna Gopal Mollik in Google. Will you please tell me about the availability of the book where I can find it? Onjit, I think you're probably called Shonji. Your first letter may have somehow gotten hidden. Yes, just like you, I Googled Krishna Gopal Mollik as well, and I couldn't find anything on Google. Absolutely, you're right. I think that there is one collection of his short stories, and he wrote this other book called Amar Premikara, which is Premikara, in which he actually talks about the many girlfriends that apparently he has had. But it's very interesting that when he talks about his girlfriend, he says he says something like, I am 101% homosexual or something. So he's constantly playing with these sexual categories. The collection of Krishna Gopal Mollik's short stories are available in College Street. At least that is where my friend got it. But Shonji, if you get in touch with me, I will be able to tell you the exact bibliographical details that you can actually track down the work of Krishna Gopal Mollik. Oh, there are other questions. So sorry. I think there are other questions as well. Right. Oh gosh, there are a lot of questions. Salma Khatun, sir, what is your view on situational homosexuality? I will simply say that it is possible. It is possible that in a certain situation, people experiment sexually with people of their own gender. So I'll simply say that it is possible, and then there is nothing wrong about it. If that is what happens, then that is what happens. What is the importance of gender and sexuality in literature? Everything. I think it has great deal of importance, because of the way in which language in patriarchy is heavily gendered. So there is a way in which there are certain things that patriarchy tells us we should talk about, and there are certain things that patriarchy tells us we shouldn't talk about. So therefore, these restrictions are something that we very often find in our academic curriculum, for example, in the syllabus. There are many teachers, for example, who are very, very shy about discussing gender and sexuality in a literature class. So you will then have to ask, these teachers, exactly what are they so shy of? So there is a way in which gender and sexuality informs much of the literature that we study, overtly or covertly. So it becomes almost the duty of the student to explore the ways in which gender and sexuality becomes coded in the literature. Sometimes it is invisible, but one has to read very carefully to understand how coded it is. Would you say it is a precursor to such LGBT? No, I think that there are, Bobita, thank you for your question. I think there are other works in which sort of sexuality is explored. But I certainly think that Krishna Gopal Mollik deserves more attention. I'm not terribly sure whether precursor is the word, but I think that he certainly deserves a mention. My question is, why a woman always a symbol of sexuality? A woman is always a symbol of sexuality because men have been in control of talking about sexuality for all these centuries, which is why men have consistently sexualized women, heterosexual men have consistently sexualized women. And it is also because patriarchy regards woman as a sexual being, Remember that a woman's value in the eyes of patriarchy is her uterus, not her brain, not her intellectual accomplishments, not the amount of money that she earns, but whether she is married or whether she is having children. So in society, women are still regarded as a sexually productive machine. And that is why this constant sexualization of women continues to happen. It is completely patriarchal. Shogun Tripathi, a query, sir. As you said in the initial stage, homosexual literature demanded a kind of sympathy. Can we distinguish it from other demands or peculiar tones of homosexual writers down the ages? Yes. So initially it demanded sympathy, but then of course it was much more about self-assertion. It was also about the right to a happy ending. I would certainly want you to look at E.M. Foster's novel Morris, because that is a very political novel, because E.M. Foster writes this novel about two men who fall in love, and E.M. Foster gives it a happy ending. So there is a sense of so the happy ending becomes very political, right? So you have a lot of literature that is produced subsequently, which is much more politically conscious. And there is a lot of LGBT literature that basically says that we are not going to ask for sympathy, we are not going to ask for pity, we are simply going to say that this is our sexuality and you have to accept it. How can anyone judge gender of God Almighty? True, yes, very good point. How would you compare Sir Amar Premikara with Khushwant Singh's The Company of Women? I think that there is the quality of Amar Premikara is much more playful and not very misogynist. That is what I would say. Khaled Hosseini's book, The Kite Runner, where small boys with physical... Yes, absolutely. What is your take on this? There, of course, it is horrendous. I mean, absolutely. I'm very glad that you mentioned Khaled Hosseini. Yes, that is horrible. That is horribly presented. I mean, it is a crime. It is completely a crime. And of course, over here, what is happening, this is improper too. So I am not in any way condoning this kind of sexually using a boy. I'm not condoning that at all. What I'm simply saying is that the way in which, Krishna Gopal Mullik talks about it, it is the tone that is very interesting. That I think is something that I would want to pay attention to. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, sexual exploitation of children is condemnable, whatever be the gender. I think that is all the questions we have. Oh, there is one more. Why all time only female judging female for sexuality by someone, not men? Why all time only female judging female for sexuality by some... I'm not terribly sure I understand what you are trying to say, but I think we judge each other sexually all the time. Men judge other men too. Women judge women, men judge women, women judge men. We are constantly judging each other sexually, and that I think is something which really should be discouraged. Certainly. Some of the poetesses have composed many works. It has seen that in most of their works they have men point of view. Yeah, is that because gender or anything else? I think that this is the liberty of the poet. The poet can choose to take the position of any gender the poet wishes. Those of you who are interested in the history of the ghazal will know that when ghazals were originally written, ghazals were written very much as men addressing men. So therefore, there is a very, very long history of ghazals written by men for men. So that is also something that is happening. So I mean, the gender is something that literatures have played with very, very often. Thank you. I think that is all the questions we have. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Niladri sir, for such insightful lecture and for facing the questions as well. Your lecture, as always, was pleasing and thoughtful. There is no doubt about it. Now, I request the audience if they okay, it has been done, and we thank you very much, sir. And now we move to the next speaker. And before that, I would like to say something. It's a request to the audience. Please don't send any mail regarding the feedback link. Actually, the feedback link will be given only on the last day of the webinar on the YouTube chat box. So please don't send any mail regarding inquiry about the feedback form. Okay. And now we move to our next speaker, that is Dr. Shreya Bhattacharji. She is an associate professor in the Department of English, Central University of Jharkhand, Ranchi, India. Her academic interests include post-colonial studies, especially African, Afro-American, Caribbean, queer, and women writings, border and partisan studies, and contemporary literary theories. She has published widely and has been invited to numerous conferences in India as also in the United States, France, Hungary, South Africa, and South Korea. Formerly a civil services officer, she also nurtures a keen interest in human rights, tribal, and gender issues. The title of her talk is Untwining Threads of Gender in Select African Narratives, His Stories and Hers. Now, I would like to request Professor Shreya Bhattacharji ma'am to begin the lecture. It's to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely audible, ma'am.
Right. Thank you so much, Bhaskar, for the kind invitation and the kind introduction too. And I thank Fatehpuria College for this platform. I would like to do a PowerPoint presentation. Is that all right, Bhaskar?
Yes,
Can
ma'am.
I?
Certainly, you can do that. Yes,
Right,
yes, yes.
right. Bhaskar, if you would just tell me if the slide is visible. Hello?
Yes, ma'am, yes.
Is it
Visible, ma'am.
is it visible? Right. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Uh, Good afternoon to everyone present today for this talk. My presentation is titled Untwining Threads of Gender in Select African Narratives, His Stories and Hers. Now, when we talk about a phenomenon as colossal as colonialism, we have to be very careful because there are very powerful ramifications of this term. If we talk about post colonialism or if we talk about pre colonialism, in either case, it is the phenomena of colonialism which occupies center stage. So, without a study of colonialism, it is very difficult to understand what if there is anything called post colonial. Now, just to stress upon how colossal this phenomenon was, there is a statistics here. At one point of time, that is between 1492 to 1914, Europeans had conquered or colonized more than 80% of the entire world. Europe consists only 8% of the planet's landmass, and it had conquered 80% of the entire world. And the heyday of these phenomenon was between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? So this phenomenon had huge ramifications. Now, there are two important things which we need to understand before we move on to what I'm going to talk about. One is the 0 point in history. That is, the history of any colony, you see, it seems to begin at that point of time when the first white man set his foot on the prospective colony. You know, any history of the land or the people prior to the arrival of the white man is neatly relegated to the realm of the pre-colonial, to the dark ages, to the pre-colonial ages. You know, the history of the colony begins from the point when the first white man set his foot on the prospective colony. That's it. The next important issue is that of the colonial gaze. That is, how did the colonizer look at the prospective colony? And herein lies something very invasive, something which is very malignant. The colonial gaze envisioned the prospective colony as a virgin land. I mean, and herein begins the politics of landscape as bodyscape. Look at the word virgin. The colony is land as woman, and that is how the colonial gaze looks at it. And the next important point, and this is, of course, one of the most insidious of colonial tools, that is, in colonial discourse, the rape of the colony, by rape, I mean the rape of the landscape, as in loot, plunder, you name it, plantations, minings, so and on and so forth, and also the rape of the colonized woman, that is always portrayed as romance. It is almost as if the colony is waiting, rather inviting the embrace of the colonizer. And the colonized woman is looking up to the colonizer as her prospective savior. And this is how the colonial discourse is created. To illustrate what I have just talked about, this concept of landscape as bodyscape, I will show you a couple of remarkable engravings. The first one that you see, this is a very famous engraving by Johannes Tredenus, and it is called The Discovery of America. What you see here is an overtly clothed Americo Vespucci, the Florentine navigator, and he seems to be awakening a sleeping America, an America as continent, as woman, as you can see, is naked, and she is just waking up. It is the ideal picture of rape as romance, right? Let us look at another famous painting. This is by this is also an engraving. This is by the Dutch engraver Cornelius van Dalen II. And here you see America once again personified as a woman with a headdress of feathers and arrows. If you look at the picture very carefully, you can see the native Indian or the American Indian settlements on the left. And once again, look at this. This is engraving by Adrian Collard, the Flemish designer and engraver. And once again, here you see the personification of America, and this time she is on the back of an armadillo. If you look carefully on your right, you can see the colonizers have already arrived. If you look at the left, you can see the traditional way of life. If we move further, now once again, this is an engraving by the same artist, Adrian Collard. And here you see a woman sitting on a crocodile, and she is Africa. So you see how Africa is being represented in the imagination. Africa riding a crocodile. Now, from here, if we move on to what happens during the colonial process, the colonial administrator, and almost always the colonizer doubled as an amateur anthropologist, it is he who would write the history of the margin. And with a supreme arrogant gaze, he would intrude into the pulsating matrix of the native cultures and yet be unable to comprehend it. But being the master, obviously, he doesn't understand that he doesn't comprehend. And so his interpretation of the culture would float in the colonial discourse as the only valid one. Obviously, we understand from Edward Said's concept of positional privilege that it is the victor who always writes the history. So in this case, obviously, it is the colonizer who is writing the history of the marching. So in these discourses, the first to be flaunted was the polygenetic theory of race, wherein the black race was considered to be almost a different species. Right? It was a different species. And so if it is a different species, you are allowed to exploit it. Now, with Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859, and which is considered to be the foundation of evolutionary biology, it established the monogenetic theory of race, wherein all human beings were scientifically proved to belong to the same species, that of Homo sapiens. Now, once this had been proved, there was a problem. What was the problem? How then to exploit those who look different from you? So there was this construction of the hierarchical race ladder, right? How did it go? At the top, it would be the white man, followed by the white woman. Then it may be yellow or brown man, yellow or brown woman. At the bottom, it would be the black man, and at the rock bottom, it would be the black woman. And so you see, the Africans, obviously, they are supposed to be despicable human beings, and they are located at the very bottom of this hierarchy. Now, it is also very interesting that Africans, Africa is a continent, a huge continent with so many countries today. But when you look at colonial discourse, all Africans seem to be homogenized as primitive collective beings. And why colonial discourse? If you read somebody as recent as Binyavanga Wainaina from Kenya, in his landmark essay, How to Write About Africa, he says that this trope still continues, whereas all Africans are collective beings and the continent of Africa is portrayed as a country, right? So these kind of primitive collective beings are obviously assumed to reside in an unspeakable society which has no ethics and no morality, right? On your right, you can see one more painting by Antoine Coipel, the French painter, and once again there is the personification of Africa as a naked woman. Now, the African woman then is obviously assigned the status of the double negative. And this I like to look at it this way. I call it the other's other. She is the African is the other. If we look at the Maniacan aesthetics of Abdul Jan Muhammad, the self and the other, the European versus the African, and then the African woman is the African's other. So she is at a position of a double negative, right? Now, Annie McClintock, in her wonderful book, Imperial Leather, Race, Gender and Sexuality in the Colonial Contest, introduces this concept of the pornotropics. Now, what is the meaning of pornotropics? What she says is that in the sex-obsessed, yet Christianity restricted European imagination, the colony became the pornotropic. And it was here that the sexual fantasies of the white colonial male, which had to follow certain norms and regulations while being in Europe, could run riot. In Africa, it was a free for all. And the sexual perversion of this psyche is reflected in both the obsession with the nakedness of the other and the deviant sexual customs of the other. And of course, it resulted in a lot of transgressive sexual relationships with the other. In this kind of a context, we can understand that the African women has been consumed by racism, colonialism, patriarchy, and obviously by racist colonial patriarchal power discourses, right? So against this backdrop, the backdrop of colonial discourse where the African woman has, kind of occupied the position of the rock bottom. She is at the double negative, the other's other. In this context, we look at the two authors that I have picked up for today's discussion. One, of course, with whom you are, I'm sure, most of the students also are familiar, the noted Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe. And on your left, you can see a wonderful novelist, again from Nigeria, Akachi Adimora Ezekwo. Now, as you know, both of them belong to the Igbo community of Southeast Nigeria, and both of them have written their first texts about the coming of colonialism to Igbo land. The texts that I have chosen for today are, of course, one we are all familiar with, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and the other is The Last of the Strong Ones by Akachi Adimora Ezekwo. Now, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart was published in 1958, and it was perhaps one of the very first texts to be written from the point of view of the native African, right? And Akachi Adimora Ezekwo's The Last of the Strong Ones was published in 1996, right? Almost, quite a few decades after Things Fall Apart. But then they both follow the same timeline and are located in the same place, Southeast Nigeria, in the heart of Igbo land. To lend socio-anthropological authentication to what I'm saying, I have also studied in detail two anthropologists. The first is G.T. Basden, who's among the Igbos of Nigeria, and Niger Igbos are two seminal works on the Igbo community. And perhaps you'll be surprised to know that Chinua Achebe's grandfather and father both knew G.T. Basden. And in fact, Chinua Achebe drew a lot of things for his novel from G.T. Basden. The other anthropologist that I'm talking about, she is contemporary, she is Black, she is female, and she is called Ifi Amadioum, and her book is called Male Daughters, Female Husbands, Gender and Sex in an African Society. And this goes to the title of my presentation today, his stories and hers. Chinua Achebe is also talking about his Igbo community and trying to set the colonial record right, but that is from a male perspective. And we have Akachi Adimora Ezigbo also attempting a similar thing many years after Achebe, but herein from the point of view of a woman. Now, one of the questions which has always bothered me, and incidentally, my research, that is my PhD, is also on Chinua Achebe, has been that why a writer like Chinua Achebe, who is devastatingly honest and very committed, and he explicitly states that he is writing an alternate version of history which is designed to set the colonial records right. Now, if it is so, why did he not highlight the empowered position enjoyed by Igbo women in the traditional Igbo milieu? This is a question which has always bothered me. Now, let us look at the traditional Igbo community of Nigeria as reflected in these two texts. Now, both, I mean, you can almost read Adimora Ezigbo's text as a counter narrative to Chinua Achebe's text. Now, Achebe and Adimora Ezigbo, they both agree in their depiction of Igbo patriarchy as being dominated by powerful mother goddesses. Very interestingly, these goddesses do not desire either husbands or consorts. In fact, the only goddess with a husband, Itimeri or Itimeli, has Nakwo, who defers to her in all matters. All of us have read Things Fall Apart, so you know in that text, Ani is the earth mother. The powerful oracle of the hills and the caves is called Agbala, which means woman. Agbala is served by a priestess, Shielo. We know that in the Igbo community, children are named Naneka, which means mother is supreme, and a woman is always buried in her motherland. The Igbos believe that when life is sweet, a man stays in his fatherland, but at the time of suffering, he always goes to his motherland. He finds refuge and consolation there. If you remember, after Okonkwo had inadvertently killed Ezeudu's son in Things Fall Apart, he had to seek refuge in his mother's homeland, that is Mabanta, for 7 years as a repentance. Now, if we look at the political scenario of these supposedly pre-colonial villages, Achebe shows the society to be democratic and republican and governed by social consensus, to be more precise, adult male consciences. The Nadichi or the elders, the Egwugwu or the masked ancestral spirits. I will discuss the Egwugwu, the masked ancestral spirits who perform the role of reconciliatory law courts, and the titled men. They have huge respect and a powerful voice. This is what Achebe shows. What Adimora Ezbo shows is the Obuofo or the inner council that is constituted of, and I mean, that is the most powerful socio-political governing body at the grassroots level, and it is constituted of both men and women chosen on merit. In fact, Adimora Ezigbo also shows the Oluoda or the top women representatives, although they are a minority in the council, but nonetheless they have a powerful presence. If we look at the position of women in economy, you will be surprised. Here, both the narrative and the counter narrative match when they show that the Igbo women in the traditional milieu enjoyed extensive freedom, although this was a patriarchal world and also a polygamous world. Now, the women enjoyed the luxury and privacy of their own huts. They were independent economically, They functioned as farmers and petty traders, and some of them even functioned as long distance traders. Women occupied, especially wives, they had a central place in the subsistence agrarian economy, and men gained authority through ritual specialization and ritual control. If we look at the myths, the creation myths, and the gender ideologies, we find that there is a neat division of labor and crops. The growth of yam is the prerogative of men. Cocoyam, cassava, melons, beans, these are grown by women. You'll be surprised that in a family meal, the yam and meat is supposed to be provided by the man, whereas the woman is supposed to provide the vegetables and fish and eggs on rare occasions. Most women had their own market stalls, and they sold everything from agricultural produce to pottery to mats to baskets. An Igbo woman always purchased her own luxuries. The markets were run, policed, and maintained by women. The presiding deity of each market was also a woman. And this holds true in many African countries even today. If you happen to visit a country like Ghana and you go to the capital Accra, and you look at the marketplaces, it is entirely run by women even today, right? So this cash exchange and control was a prerogative of women, and G.T. Baston very clearly states that prostitution as a phenomenon had never existed in traditional patriarchal Igbo land. Now, if we come to women in creative professions, we find that unlike Achebe does not mention it, but Adimora Ezigbo shows women to be involved in very creative professions. For example, in handicrafts, drawing, painting, and in fact, professional beauticians had a huge role in this traditional milieu. Women were also poet raconteurs, chanters, storytellers, and they were hugely respected as cultural custodians, authentic recorders and portrayers of history. In fact, these women had a stupendous memory, and they would be able to chant the history to the coming generations. Right? In this world, talented single women could maintain their status in style. In fact, Adimora Ezigbo talks about Shieme the chanter. She was Oluoda who showed the world that a woman's reputation does not depend on a husband. Now, if we talk about titles, now the Igbo patriarchy had an elaborate system of titles for men. The first three were inexpensive titles: Shi, Ifejioko, and Ikwo, and it signaled a boy's growth to maturity. The next four titles, Ozo, Idimeli, Omalo, and Erilu, with a legendary fifth, Ize, highlighted an Igbo man's gradual climb up the Igbo hegemonic ladder. In the high title of Ozo, it was mandatory, that the man would be accompanied by his daughter when he went to invoke Idimeli, the daughter of God. Now, you might feel that what is the significance of these titles? There were two things. One, when you attained a high title, along with it came a lot of social responsibility, right? It is not just you gain power plus you gain a lot of social responsibility. That is one. And the second is you were supposed to spend a lot of money. This would require a lot of rituals, feasts. So it was to ensure that you did not become too rich. At the same time, you did not become too powerful. It was a kind of a cross check. Now, very interestingly, the fifth title, that is Ize, nobody ever attained it because it signified a king. And the Igbos have always been a kingless society. They have been more of a democratic and a republican society. Very interestingly, Achebe makes no mention of titles for women. But if we look at the text of Ifi Amadioum, the anthropologist, we find that there was a custom of two kinds of title for women. One was voluntary, the other was involuntary. And these titles went to women who were very industrious and resourceful. Now, very rich women could sacrifice women and take the voluntary title Ogbuifi. But the goddess Idimeli bestowed the involuntary title Ikwe on her chosen women. And who were these women? These were women who, due to their own hard work and enterprise, were socially and economically very well placed. The most senior Ikwe titled woman, Agba Ikwe, possessed vetoing rights in the town assembly. G.T. Basden, the white anthropologist, mentions that the power of the Ozo titled man could be challenged, but the position of the Agba Ikwe was never disputed. Adimora Ezigbo shows Shieme, the chanter, taking the title Lulu. Having accumulated wealth and made a name in my profession, I became Lulu and chose the title Ome Saranya. Now, Achebe also speaks of praise titles, praise songs, and praise chants only for women, only for men. But in Adimora Ezigbo's text, we find praise titles, songs, and chants for both men and women. Now, both the texts, Achebe's and Adimora Ezigbo's, agree upon the cultural phenomenon of age grade in Igbo society. Now, this is a very interesting phenomenon. Igbo children who were born within a stipulated 1-year period belong to a particular age group demarcated along gender lines. So you see, these age grades, they cut across political, social, economic compartmentalization, and they served as remarkable community welfare organizations. You see, what would happen is that these boys and these girls, they would grow up together with certain responsibilities. Like one age grade would be said that you have the job of cleaning the road, another would be said that you have the job of looking after the temple, and so on. So they would grow up together and they were supposed to help each other. For example, if one in the age grade got married, the entire age grade would gather and help. Similarly, in the case of the construction of a house. So when they came to power, when they attained titles, came to power, the whole group would come to power together. And obviously that meant that the village would be governed in a far more congenial atmosphere. Now I come to two very interesting concepts. One is the concept of female husband. Now, Igbos separated gender from biological sex. So, Igbo women aspired to be males, not men, mind you, males, the gender that is associated with power, authority, and affluence. Now, this cultural institution of female husband, it enabled resourceful Igbo women to succeed in business, and they could amass wealth, titles, social prestige, because these women could pay the bride price and buy wives to enrich their trade. In fact, this is there is historical evidence that there was this legendary female husband called Navambata Aku, who was renowned for her 24 wives. Now, husbands, surprisingly, although it is a patriarchy, husbands appreciated successful wives. Though obviously rivalries existed between successful women and their husbands, these women did not attract societal stigma. In fact, Adimora Ezigbo mentions this institution, a powerful woman who had 3 wives in the land of Umulopia. However, there is no mention of this cultural institution in Achebe's narrative. Now, let me make one thing clear, that I am not talking, when I'm talking about a female husband paying the bride price to buy a wife, I'm not talking about anything like lesbianism. What I'm talking about is that the bride price would be paid by the female husband, and the wife would help in expanding the business empire, so to speak. But she would be allowed to take a consort, she would be allowed to have children, but those children would take the name of the female husband and not of the consort. This is how it functioned. The next interesting cultural institution was that of the male daughter. Herein, you see, this institute could confer male status, that is, rights and privileges of a son, to married or unmarried daughters. Sometimes, the daughter of a man who did not have a male heir could opt to stay in her father's patrilineage. She could refuse marriage and normative family life and choose a mate of her liking to perpetuate the family tree, her father's lineage. Alternatively, sometimes a daughter could be recalled from her marital home to be to be conferred the status of a son to enable her to inherit her father's property. When we look at Adimora Ezegbu's text, we find this concept of Naloikava. In fact, Aziagba, the unmarried daughter of Abiatu, chooses to stay at home and perpetuate her patrilineage. In Achebe, we do not find any mention of this cultural institution. Now, if we look at the institution of marriage, now both the narratives agree on this. Now, marriage obviously was a very important institution in the Igbo community, as in most communities. What is very interesting is the Igbo ritual of Puri, which initiated the would-be bride's long familiarization visit to her in-laws' place. I always think that this is a fantastic idea. That is, prior to the marriage, the would-be wife would go to the would-be groom's place and usually spend 4 weeks there to assess if she was compatible with that family, and that family would also check if they were compatible with this wife. And if it worked out, only then the marriage negotiations would proceed further. Now, if you look at another marriage ritual, this is also very interesting, and this I have taken from Things Fall Apart. This is the final marriage confession rite called Isa Ifi, wherein the Umuoda, that is the association of patrilineage daughters, they would question the bride-to-be in the presence of the clan head on her sexual integrity from the day of engagement. Mind you, from the day of engagement. Prior to that was not any concern of the groom's family. And the question is, how many men have lain with you since my brother first expressed the desire to marry you? Which means, in other words, the vestal status of a bride was not a prerequisite for marriage, although the vestal status of a bride had huge significance. Similarly, this concept of bride price, it also acted as a safety valve, allowing married women to exercise choice through both divorce and remarriage. Now, if a married woman chose to return to her father's place, then the father was compelled to return the bride price. But if she chose to remarry, then the husband-to-be would return the bride price on the day of the marriage. But if the husband turned her out, then the father could claim back the bride price also. Now, in this society, the levirate system of marriage prevailed. The custom of Nakusi allowed the younger brother or sometimes the eldest son of a deceased man to inherit his wife. Both the narratives agree on the marriage issues. Now, as I have mentioned, this was a patriarchal society and also a polygamous society where wife battering happened, but it invited sound redressal. In fact, the battered women could approach the Igwugwu. Now, this Igwugwu was a body of masked ancestral spirits with a semi-divine status, and they functioned as a reconciliatory law court. Now, what happened was that the most intelligent and also the most powerful and responsible men of the society, they would perform as Igwugwu, and they would be masked, and they would have a semi-divine status. So nobody would usually question their verdict. Now, these aggrieved women could also approach the women organizations. But Achebe shows the Egwugwu trying to arbitrate disturbed marriage relations. However, he does not make any mention of the women organizations in this context. Which brings me to the most interesting finding of my own research. And the most interesting finding of these societies, which are supposed to be archaic, primitive, you name it. Now, you'll be surprised to know that Igbo society boasted of three, not one, but three very powerful grassroots women organizations. And I am talking about pre-colonial, traditional Igbo society, right? Now, the first was the Umuoda or Umu Okpu. This was the Association of Patrilineage Daughters, right? And they looked after the interests of daughters as opposed to wives. They were supposed to be the ritual specialists, and they dealt with confessions of infidelity or adultery by wives, and they cleansed the patrilineage of pollution or abominations. In fact, they were kind of a male policing force curbing the excessive power of the patrilineage wives. There is only one mention of this institute in Things Fall Apart. If you remember, we just mentioned it. It is this association of patrilineage daughters that questions the bride about her vestal status before marriage, right? But Adimora Ezigbo speaks at length about this institution. The second very interesting organization was called the Alutardi or Inyomdi. This was the Association of Patrilineage Wives, and they monitored the interests of the wives. And their demands were usually very reasonable. For example, the repair of dangerous roads, or sanctions on those who maltreated their wives, or youths who harassed young girls, this kind of issues. Now, I could not resist, quoting one stringent measure undertaken by this body to control the excesses of a patriarchal cosmos. I have taken this from Adimora Ezigbo. Look, I read it and then I explain. We organized the women against Egwuagu when he unjustly drove his wife away. We descended on him like a swarm of bees with the full intent to sting sense into him. We turned ourselves into human litter, occupying every available space in his large Nagpuru. A day later, he indicated his willingness to talk with his in-laws. I mean, all of us can almost visualize it, right? Here is a man who is a wife batterer, and he has thrown his wife out of his home, saying that she is human litter, right? So she goes to this organization, and what does this organization do? All the women, they come to Egwuagu's house when he is not there, and they occupy the entire space of his large home. And when he comes back, they tell him that we are all human litter, we are all garbage, please throw each one of us out. Obviously, the man, has no, option but to talk with his in-laws and take his wife back. Very surprisingly, Achebe does not make a single reference to this institution. The third and the most powerful of these women's organizations was the Inyom Nanobi, or the Women's Council, which stood for all women. The Igbo power hierarchy could take no decision on women-related issues without its consent. And all these three organizations, they could demonstrate, and they could even go on strike. And these strikes were equally successful and equally notorious. And some of the methods were, all the women in the village might refuse to cook for their husbands and families. They might refuse to have sexual intercourse with their husbands. Or there was an even better way, in one instance, and this has historical evidence, all the women of a particular village, they left for their own villages, leaving the small children at home, the toddlers, so that the men were taught a lesson. So these organizations, the presence of these organizations at the grassroots level in every village in Igbo land in southeast Nigeria prior to the arrival of the British colonizer in the 1880s, it kind of shatters the myth of Euro America being the progenitor of the women's slave, right? But surprisingly, these organizations find no mention in Achebe. Now, I take you to one more very relevant chapter in Igbo history. This was the Women's War of 1929, which shook the very foundation of colonial British government in Nigeria. This was uh, in the Women's War of 1929. There were mass demonstrations by Igbo women, mostly peaceful but sometimes also violent, and it caught the colonial government off guard. And I quote, the women were rebellious and rioting all over the place with a militancy unfamiliar to white men. And these protests were against taxation, against warrant chiefs, issues which were very, very volatile and very, the protests were very logical. Now, organized female protest against exploitative power structures was not a new phenomenon in Igbo land. There is a history to it. As the anthropologist Ifi Amadium says, this kind of militant feminism, it was a constant reality for women in traditional Igbo societies. But it is a comparatively new phenomenon in the West and the monopoly of the elitist few. Now, when I come to draw my conclusions, you see, that the colonial master discourse would indulge in the dirty politics of exclusion and distortion, this is expected, right? That is why I began this presentation by showing you what was the colonial gaze and how did the colonial discourse reflect upon it, right? That such discourse would attempt the erasure of gender-friendly grassroots socio-cultural institutions and traditions is also expected. Obviously, if the colonizer is writing the discourse, he would not like to show something like the grassroots women organization in every village. When we come to the colonial government, which in unholy connivance with the patriarchal colonized stooges or power mongers, they eroded the traditional power position enjoyed by Igbo women in colonial Nigeria. This is also expected. You see, now there is a kind of a compact between the colonial government on the one hand and the patriarchal colonized stooges on the other, and both of them work in tandem to erode the power positions enjoyed by Igbo women. That this legacy has continued in present day, supposedly post-colonial Nigeria also does not come as a surprise. The surprise, and that is why I talk about untwining the threads of gender and his narratives and hers. The surprise lies in Achebe's narrative, in the very vocal, silent. Achebe obviously is not with the colonizer. He is writing the insider's story. And if you read Things Fall Apart, written when Achebe was only 28, it is such a matured, such a restrained, such a wonderful piece of work, so intuitive, and written by a man who did not have, any history of such writing to look back upon. He was writing an alternative discourse, and he claims that he was doing so. So if he was doing so, could he really afford a myopic masculine vision? A vision that renders such women-friendly institutions and traditions invisible? Could he really afford to do that? Because generations have grown up reading Chinua Achebe, right? So could he really render these women organizations, these women friendly traditions invisible? Why did he do it? So the question that comes to my mind is, did he become party to the master discourse that renders women invisible, like all other master discourse? Was he party to it? And is he then guilty of signing the colonial compact? The blatant patriarchal assumption on both sides of the colonial divide that it is a patriarchy on both sides becoming hand in glove and signing the colonial compact, that women are willing prey for appropriation, invisibility, and even erasure. Was he guilty of signing the colonial compact? Now, or did he think that the mention of such women friendly institutions and traditions, particularly the women organizations, the three women organizations that we have seen, did he think that the mention of these women organizations would electrify Western audiences and lead to the loss of his credibility as an author of an authentic African narrative? Did he think so? I mean, would the audience not be able to accept that such organizations, such traditions could exist in what is, supposedly a pagan, primitive, barbaric world, and and by default, it would make him lose his credibility as an author of an authentic African narrative. Is that the reason? And at this juncture, we must remember that it was well into the 60s of the previous century that women emerged from behind the invisible curtain in Western Europe and North America. And we must also remember that the chastity belt was not created in Africa, but in Europe, right? So, was it then a Things Fall Apart in 1958 that sought to establish a primitive within double quote, savage within double quote, pagan within double quote culture as the progenitor of the women's slave in the world, would perhaps have caused a storm that even an Achebe could not withstand? Was it so? And is that why Achebe did not mention any of these traditions and any of these organizations in Things Fall Apart? Sometimes I also think that was there this issue of um, readership and publication. Would people have published him if he had written it? And would it have sold if this book, which had included the women's organizations, would it have sold at that juncture in 1958? These are questions which come to my mind and which bother me. And although Achebe and Akachi Adimora Ezigbo are both wonderful writers, we very clearly see the difference in the his story and the her story so far as gender issues in both supposedly post-colonial texts are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shreya ma'am, for such insightful lecture, and really it was very enjoyable, and for the listeners too. And with this, I now take some questions, ma'am, and I just put them in the chat box. Just please answer them whenever it is possible. Okay, ma'am.
I will be grateful if you would read me the questions, if that is possible.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Shohini Sen has wrote a question. If we assign the status of double negative to the African women, what status can we assign to the slave women of Africa? They were even more marginalized. How will you describe them?
Yes, obviously. In fact, that is a very pertinent question, because no study of colonialism and post-colonialism is complete if we also do not look at the history of slavery, and obviously the position of the Afro-American slave woman would be at a position that is even worse than that of the African woman. Maybe at the triple negative, one more step down. And in fact, one of the best books that comes to my mind is Ya Gyasi's The Home Going, which talks about two women who are half sisters. One goes on to become the mistress of the slave governor in the Gold Coast, and the other goes on to become a slave and is taken by the slave ship to America. So obviously, yes, indeed, the African American slave woman, that is a history which is even more painful than of the colonized African woman. Indeed, yes.
Okay, next by Sharbani Ghosh. Africa women in literature expressed as a woman whose life is in her household, and their fondness and dedication towards household extends as a development of world is this willing or they are forced to do.
See, it depends on what we are talking about and which texts we are talking about, because society evolves, you see, and with this evolution, the texts that represent the society also obviously change. Now, if we look at Things Fall Apart and half of and The Last of the Strong Ones, that is one world. If we look at the present generation of writers, that is another world. Say, for example, in between, you can look at the works of Buchi Amaechina or Flora Nawapa, that is one world. If you look at writers like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is writing now, it is a very different world, you see, and the and the representation of women in these texts also change, because the African woman of 2020 will obviously not be the same woman whom you met. For example, if you met Ekwifi in Things Fall Apart in 1880, the world has changed, African societies have evolved, and women have also changed. It depends on how we look at it.
Okay, the next one is by Naki Chatter. Females who consider themselves as a female have or married to individuals from the same sex, or do wives here mean husbands?
No, that's what I explained, that a female husband would pay the bride price and buy the wife. Now, this wife would aid and assist her female husband in matters of business enterprise. As far as her sexual needs were concerned, she could, choose a consort of her own liking, and she could even have children through them. But the child born of these relationship would have to take the surname of the female husband. This is how it operated.
Okay. The next one is Igbo additions, social issues, male-female relations, women restricted to Igbo community in Nigeria or span across the entire Africa race, Africa in America, etc.
Sorry, I did not get the question. Can you please repeat the question?
Igbo traditions, societal ideologies. Okay, ma'am. Igbo traditions, societal ideologies, like male-female relation, equality, stronger women, restricted to Igbo community in Nigeria, or span across the entire African race, or African in American?
See, this is what I was trying to explain, that Africa is a huge place. You see, it is a continent, number one, and the Igbo community with which I dealt today is only one community among thousands of communities living in Africa and also in the diaspora. Now, what I'm trying to say and what I said today is limited to the Igbo community, and that also the Igbo community of the 1880s, 1890s. But these traditions would be there in the Igbo community today. As far as the other communities of Africa, obviously they will have their own different traditions and customs. They might not be the same. They might show some similarities sometimes, but obviously they are not going to be the same.
Okay.
May I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
May I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. My name is Shekhar Shil. I was the ex-faculty of this college. So I'm just taking cue from your whole story. That are you necessarily try to relate the pre-colonial situation, and if yes, then how could you theoretically frame this whole thing within the post-colonial context?
Yeah, that is exactly what I was trying to do. You know that the first problem is, of course, with the coinage of the word post-colonial, because I would much rather like to call it something like neo-colonial or ultra-colonial or maybe pseudo-colonial. That is one. The second thing is, my entire argument was that these two texts that have been written, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which was written in 1958, and Akachi Adimora Ezigbo's The Last of the Strong Ones, which was written in 1996, one by a black male writer, the other by a black female writer, both supposedly trying to set the historical record right by kind of portraying their own world orders prior to the arrival of the white man. And yet there is so much difference in the two portrayals. Both are supposedly within double quote post-colonial texts, right? And yet the the one is a kind of a myopic narrative, and the other acts as a kind of gendered intervention onto it, right? And together they define how a post-colonial narrative needs to be read with a lot of caution, a lot of filter. You cannot take anything at its face value. You need to untwine the threads very, very carefully. Otherwise, you fall into the trap that Michel Foucault talks about, that of the, all discourses are suspect. And if you are not careful, you will fall into the trap. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you.
The last question: can the custom of offering bride price be compared with the negotiated marriage practiced by some indigenous groups in Northeast India?
Yes, of course. This concept of bride price is common to many tribal communities across the world. It is not only present in certain communities in Africa, but also in India, for example. Yes, of course, in the Northeast, in many communities in the Northeast, also in Jharkhand, in Chhattisgarh, in many areas. This custom is common to them. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. And on behalf of my college, I really thank you for your lecture. And in future, whenever we'll try to arrange such webinars or seminars, we would certainly invite you. And thank you very much. And with this, I just bring an end to the session. And for the next session, the speaker has already joined the group, and her name is Dr. Esra Mirje Shantesho. She is an associate professor and associate department head in the Georgiana University, in the University of Georgia, USA. She received her BA from Bogaciki University in Istanbul, Turkey, and her PhD from the University of Nevada. She specializes in post-colonial theory and literature with an emphasis on diasporic and immigrant narratives. Her book, Disorientation Muslim Identity in Contemporary Anglophone Literature, investigates the extent to which the questions and theories of post-colonial identity can be applied to Muslim subjects living in the West. Her articles have appeared in numerous edited collections and in journals such as Post-Colonial Inventions, Literary Research, The Comparatist, and the Post-Colonial Text. She teaches a variety of courses in the post-colonial studies. The title of her today's talk is Islamic Feminism and Female Superheroes in Graphic Narratives. Now, I would like to request Dr. Esra Shantesho, ma'am, to begin the lecture. It's to you, ma'am.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and greetings from a very early morning from Athens, Georgia. I would like to start by thanking SR Fatehpuri College for organizing this webinar. And I especially would like to extend my warm thanks to Dr. Sarkar for kindly inviting me. As Dr. Sarkar mentioned, I work on Muslim literature, and my interest has begun once I left Turkey to come and study in the US. And all of a sudden, I found that there were very interesting kinds of negotiations that was happening around me as a part of the Muslim diaspora. So my first book, Disorientation, which investigated Muslim identity within Anglophone literature, was a part of that kind of a query to think about how people have to rethink their religious identities once they leave their Muslim homelands and get relocated somewhere in the West, and they have to kind of negotiate this or navigate the Western secular sphere to have a better understanding of themselves and their communities. My second book, Islam and Postcolonial Discourse, was an edited collection that studied the kind of the overlap between post-secular and post-colonial discourse. And currently, as Dr. Sarkar mentioned, I found myself studying comics, which is very unusual because I was never a comics fan as I was growing up. I never read comics that much. But I'm very happy to tell you, maybe during the question and answer period, how I got interested in this medium. And with that in mind, my current book project is going to be looking at the representation of Islam and Muslims in comics and graphic narratives. So I'm going to take a moment to start my PowerPoint presentation. I think that would make things a little bit easier for people to follow. Okay, let me just go here. All right. So my talk today will consider two different kinds of relationships. First, I want to look at the overlapping interests between postcolonialism and feminism. Both areas of studies have always sought to dismantle privileged power positions. Postcolonialism, as we always know, has sought to counter colonial master narratives in order to give natives the permission to narrate their own stories, as Edward Said puts it. Likewise, feminism aims to dismantle patriarchal values. And since 1980s, there has been great effort to theorize a more diverse, inclusive, and pluralized permutations of feminism that can resist the homogenization of women and thus avoid narrow definitions of female agency entirely aligned with Eurocentric values. This interest has been captured by groundbreaking works that have been penned by a series of scholars such as Chandra Mohanty, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Ketu Katrak, to name a few. So today I want to expand on their discussion of third world feminism and consider how Islamic feminism emerges as an offshoot of that effort for inclusivity. The second relationship that I want to bring to your attention is the politics of visibility and visuality. In many ways, one can think about feminism as a discourse that engages with visibility politics, which is an essential step towards raising awareness about marginalized groups. With this in mind, I want to discuss politics of visibility in visual media, particularly in graphic narratives. The question I would like to raise is, do visibility politics always align neatly with feminist ideologies? So let me start with an iconic graphic novel penned by Marjan Satrapi. When Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis was published in 2004, it quickly captured the attention of the literary world. It was hailed not only as a unique example of exilic literature that blends the genre of memoir and graphic novel in its account of a young girl growing up in post-revolutionary Iran, but also as a fresh perspective on feminism that challenged the West's simplified and universalized understanding of gendered identity in a religious society. Western scholars especially praise Satrapi's interrogation of female subjectivity in a theocratic state. Gulnar Nabizadeh, for one, wrote that Satrapi's graphic memoir significantly contributes to feminist cultural histories because the author's story is told through a female and Iranian perspective, an imbrication that is typically excluded from Western feminist discourse. For Hilary Shute, Satrapi's focus on women in a political graphic novel creates a text that is not only keenly feminist, but also one that models a feminist methodology in its form due to its blending of text and image in order to capture the victimization of women. But what strikes me in these discussions is a narrow definition of feminism, one that relies heavily on visibility politics without cultivating a philosophical and political commitment to gender equality, one that considers a text feminist simply because it features a female perspective. But even more surprising is the deafening silence about religion. While there are several references to the theocratic regime and the constitutional changes put forward by the Khomeini government, not one scholar considers the role of Islam itself in shaping female agency in Persepolis. Shute argues that the success of a feminist memoir must be measured by its ability to visualize the everyday experiences of women against an extraordinary backdrop. If this is so, then ignoring how these daily routines are shaped by collective understandings of religion, as well as personal negotiations of spirituality, seems myopic. This critical void is precisely what I would like to respond to today in my talk. What does it mean for a graphic novel to be feminist? What does it mean for a graphic novel to be Islamic? Can a graphic novel be Islamic and feminist at the same time? For reasons that will become clear, my discussion will move away from the graphic autobiography and focus instead on superhero narratives, a subcategory that typically features supernaturally powerful characters working to defend average people against evil and corruption. My immediate interest in the superhero narrative is twofold. First, considering that Western comics have a long history of racism, misogyny, and Islamophobia, I would like to investigate how the recent creation of Muslim superheroes has interrupted the existing politics and ushered in a more diverse and inclusive aesthetic practice. My second reason for turning to superhero narratives has to do with the way they traditionally serve to codify national membership by embodying the categorical values of an imagined community. Think, for example, of Superman and how he comes to embody truth, justice, and the American way. It's interesting to observe how these new Muslim characters repudiate a binary based on us versus them, and instead turn an internal gaze on their own communities, critiquing them to inspire positive change. With this in mind, my talk today will look at two such examples, namely Willow Wilson's Kamala Khan, the new Pakistani-American reincarnation of Ms. Marvel, and Dina Mohamed's Kahira, a webcomic from Egypt that features a hijabi sword fighter. I will be pursuing two related questions. First, how is Islam invoked in the portrayal of these two heroines, presented both as extensions of their communities as well as rebels who expose the ills of their respective societies? My second question is, can these two characters automatically be labeled as feminist simply by the dint of their gender as they fight against social injustices? Putting these two texts into conversation with each other will also allow me to illustrate the nuances that emerge from their situatedness in specific communities. As one, Kamala Khan concentrates on the Muslim diaspora in the United States, and the other, Kahira, focuses on the Muslim homeland in Egypt. So, let's begin with Kamala Khan. Kamala Khan, the Pakistani-American superhero of the Ms. Marvel series, enters into the comics world at a time in which nationalist, anti-Muslim, and anti-immigrant rhetoric in the US is pervasive. But also when opposition to such rhetoric is being voiced over more loudly. When it first appeared in 2015, Time declared that, quote, Marvel is winning new fans by bringing diversity to comics books. A reviewer praised the editors of the series for broadening the faces and the stories of Marvel's comics, and thus embracing the multicultural spirit of America. On the other hand, there was a larger than expected backlash. Some fans viewed this iteration as a disruption of an established storyline that betrayed the Ms. Marvel character. Some industry leaders complained that longtime customers were being alienated by too much diversity in the new comic series. The series writer Willow Wilson recalls, quote, I thought they were going to need an intern to open all the hate mail. Among them, a small group of fans went so far as to accuse both Willow Wilson and the creative director of the series, who were both Muslim American women, by the way, for promoting jihad. In many ways, the split reaction to the creation of the new Ms. Marvel illustrates the present division of American society. On the one hand, a push for inclusion and a celebration of multiculturalism as an essential American value. On the other, newly emboldened Islamophobic and xenophobic attitudes that have been normalized as part of a broader re-emergence of white nationalist rhetoric. Ms. Marvel carefully toes the line in its representation of the Muslim diaspora. It portrays Kamala Khan's family as a traditional Muslim household which adheres to the tenets of Islam and enjoys the community and the spiritual guidance provided by the leaders of the mosque. Yet, there's particular emphasis placed on the embrace of a notably secular understanding of the faith, which is instrumental in their integration. The one pious character in the family is Kamala's brother, who visually appears as a devout Muslim in traditional clothing and kufi, a skull cap. He serves as a constant target for familial insults. His mother describes him as a primitive mullah, and the father mocks his laziness, which he sees camouflaged under the pretense of devotion. When he insists on praying before meals, his father complains that, quote, prayer is notable, but when you spend all day praying, it starts to look like you're avoiding something, like finding a job, for example. Kamala's mother worries about her son's associations. She blames her husband for uprooting the family from their upper middle class neighborhood in Pakistan to a rougher immigrant neighborhood in New Jersey, where radicalism, ironically, is a more serious threat. As this exchange between the parents illustrates, far from debunking old myths about Islam, the portrayal of the brother and his exaggerated commitment to religion reinscribes certain Orientalist biases, fortifying the figure of the believing Muslim as somebody who is at heart a fanatic. The disconnect between the conservative brother and the moderate family presents another familiar binary between religion and secularism. In this instance, in its attempt to oppose Islamophobia, the comic book characterizes the one devout Muslim in the family in a way that actually preserves a certain level of ambivalence towards inclusivity and equality. Kamala exists in a stark contrast to her brother. As the book progresses, it quickly becomes apparent that for Kamala, religion does not go beyond a narrative hook. She never prioritizes Islam as an important component of her identity, as opposed to her ethnic status, which is significant to her. And indeed, beyond a nominal participation in select Islamic rituals to satisfy her parents, she hardly engages with Islam at all. If anything, Islam serves as a kind of a foil for her rebel spirit. She lusts after bacon sandwiches and attends a drinking party without the permission of her parents and sneaks out of religious sermons, which she finds enormously boring. We hear relatively little about how Kamala follows the tenets of Islam. At other times, she skips out on visits to the mosque to hang out with her friends. And again, this is understood as admirable and independent behavior that is considered to be a typical teenage angst. A critic, Joseph Hughes of Comics Alliance, states that this series will embrace and address aspects of Kamala's culture while simultaneously telling you that she's just like so many other teenagers. But this assertion of relatability is precisely where the series drops the ball. Kamala's Muslimness is ultimately sacrificed for the sake of creating a wider appeal. In this regard, while her Muslim background hints at the diversification of the American comics, as well as the normalization of the experiences and struggles of Muslims in the United States, it is highly questionable whether Kamala transcends the inherent tokenization of the character. Kahira, on the other hand, is clearly invested in and inspired by Islam. By visually marking herself as a Muslim with an abaya, covering her from head to toe, she draws on her faith as an enabling force to combat the ills of society. As Christina Ivy rightly notes, unlike other superheroes who wear capes and masks to conceal their identities, Kahira wears the hijab to project her identity as she advocates women's rights by fighting against prejudice, abuse, and economic disenfranchisement. In an early episode, we see Kahira scaling the city from above as she overhears what she calls, quote, misogynistic trash. A man preaching to a crowd declares, quote, a good wife is an obedient wife. It is your Islamic duty to keep them at home and in check. Kahira swoops down and volunteers, quote, to do the laundry by tying the man up with a clothespin. The moment is rich with irony. Kahira not only exerts her power by dint of occupying the same public space as men, but she also pushes back against sexism by humiliating the offenders through sheer force. Now, while Kahira is firmly rooted in her religion, her faith is not parochial, but rather inclusive and nonpartisan. She does not impose her religious values on others, but treats all women with respect and dignity. In one episode, she defends a non-hijabi woman who is sexually assaulted by a random stranger on the street. After the man tries to grab her, the woman, Layla, refuses to remain silent and immediately heads to a police station to report the crime. There, she is greeted by a grudging officer who remarks on her immodest clothes and inappropriate manner of dress, which he argues is an invitation to male misconduct. Clearly blaming the victim, he states, quote, "I can assure you that everyone else will agree with me that had you been dressed more modestly, this definitely wouldn't have happened." This statement appears as a text interspersed amidst a sequence of panels that depicts Kahira in her traditional abaya being verbally abused and harassed by men. The disconnect between the text and the image illustrates the misogyny is not directed at secular women only, but is experienced by women of faith as well. In a question and answer session with her readers on her blog, the author, Dina Mohammed, somewhat exacerbatedly repeats that, quote, "Of course the hijab does not prevent sexual harassment," and argues that a religious society must show harassers that there are, quote, "moral consequences for their actions." This brings me to my second question. How feminist are these two superheroes? And what does feminism mean within each context? Kamala does not shy away from getting into debates with the local imam about gender inequality. Quote, "Didn't you tell us there was no partition at the Prophet's mosque in Medina, that men and women went through the same door and sat in the same room?" But what action does she take specifically to advance women's causes as she exercises her superpowers? Similarly, we see in Kahira opposing men in many instances, but what kind of womanism does she advocate? The response to this question varies, as there are specific differences between the Muslim diaspora and the Muslim homeland in terms of taking on feminism as a just cause and a pressing social issue. Kamala is relatively uninterested in highlighting gender inequality as she navigates between two cultures. While she rarely refers to herself as a Muslim or a feminist, her prioritization of her regional identity and her identification with her hometown of Jersey City remains an indispensable component of identity. Indeed, she regularly invokes her regional identity as her primary and most significant form of affiliation, transcending race, gender, and nation. She's a local hero more than she is a Muslim or a feminist one. Kahira, on the other hand, embraces an Islamic feminist tone, utilizing Islam as the foundation of her mission to safeguard social justice and gender equality. It is neither a regional nor a national affiliation that dictates the terms of her actions. Rather, she acts against the victimization of women. For her, Islam is not only a private system of belief and self-realization, but a public avowal of a vision of an egalitarian society. She respects all sorts of female agency, defined on the basis of resistance as well as conformity. In doing so, she redefines feminism to invoke an all-inclusive understanding of womanhood. But here is even a more interesting point about Kahira. While she advocates for women's causes, she is also attentive to the missteps associated with Western feminism. As Kahira watches through her computer screen the latest protest of Femmes, a French feminist organization infamous for their provocative protest in which they bare their bosoms and write messages across their chests as a means to shock their audience, she is dismayed at the level of misinformation and judgment passed by Europeans about Muslim women. In the video, Feman declares women wearing the hijab as oppressed victims in need of saving. When Kahira transports herself to the scene of action, she is immediately marked by the protesters as the poster child of oppression based on her manner of dress. One woman screams, quote, "Look there, it's a Muslim woman. This is why we are here. We have to save her." The act of saving, a discourse that is used to legitimize Western intervention in Muslim societies, echoes what Leila Ahmed has described as colonial feminism, with serious racist implications that alienate Muslim women as irredeemable anomalies. Before the protester is able to free Kahira by ripping her dress, Kahira takes her sword out and demands to be listened to. Quote, "You have constantly undermined and ignored women. You seem unable to understand that we do not need your help, and I doubt there is much I can do to teach you." Kahira's exasperation with Western naivete and condescension stems from her sense that it is making Islamic feminist project more difficult. As Leila Abulugot argues, Muslim symbols are often misconstrued by the West. Quote, "We must take care not to reduce the diverse situations and attitudes of millions of Muslim women to a single item of clothing. Perhaps it is time to give up Western obsession with the veil and focus on some serious issues with which feminists and others should indeed be concerned." Clearly, Kahira embodies Egyptian women's ability to cultivate their own meaning of feminism and their own power to defeat sexism and the problems that come with it. Now, Kahira's creators suggest that she wanted to create a Muslim hero willing to take a stance against both the problems they have in Egypt, but also against people who try to impose their own values on Muslim women. In this regard, Kahira can be viewed as a symbol for a broader and more inclusive form of feminism, which Chandra Mohanty criticizes for resting heavily on Western assumptions of privilege and ethnocentric universality on the one hand, and inadequate self-consciousness on the other. As Winona Landis writes, when considering Kahira's specific location outside the US and the comic's attempt to reach Western readers, but also decidedly those in the Muslim diaspora, it is possible to read Kahira's daring act from another angle, the third world feminism. For Marga Badran, wedding gender equality with religious worldview is not an oxymoron, but an innovative recognition of different discourses shaping and influencing each other. Defining Islamic feminism as an exclusively religious paradigm, Badran further states, quote, "This is not to suggest or create a binary between secular feminist and Islamic feminist discourse, but rather to point to the discursive categories mobilized. There are imbrications of the secular and the religious in both discourses." Kahira certainly exemplifies that spirit. She does not discard her religion, but finds inspiration and courage in Islam to correct injustices. Ironically, however, it is perhaps Kamala Khan who found more success as a symbol of resistance to sexism and Islamophobia. Though, as I have shown, Kamala herself is essentially secular, And often critical of Islam, her mere existence as the first Muslim headliner of a popular graphic series gave her symbolic prominence, and indeed made her a face of resistance in anti-Trump rallies in the United States. This is a quote from a newspaper. Quote, "Since Donald Trump's inauguration, fans have created images of Khan tearing up a photo of the president, punching him, and this punching is very symbolic because it looks exactly like the cover of Captain America punching Hitler, which was a cover that appeared in 1941. And in addition, she grieves in her room." End quote. Kamala's adoption as an emblem of defiance was discussed in numerous media outlets. A piece that appeared in The Guardian noted that, quote, "Miss Marvel has been drafted by culture jammers in San Francisco to protest against Islamophobic adverts. It is the latest chapter in comic book diversity," end quote. So let me start my conclusion. Western comics have long featured Muslim villains as caricatured fanatics and evildoers who cannot see reason and must be eliminated by pure and good superheroes. The legacy of superficial sexism in comic books is of course indisputable and unavoidable. Miss Marvel and Kahira represent a new impetus in the graphic narrative in which the form is seen as a place to repudiate shallow representations of Islam, as well as disavowing the typical one-dimensional representations of women associated with the comics tradition. But as I have tried to show, it is not simply a case of replacing sexist and Islamophobic comics with feminist and perhaps more halal ones. And the situation is especially complex when it comes to Islamic feminist comics. As I conclude, I would like to make two final observations. First, I acknowledge that Islam and the graphic novel may seem like an odd pairing. Not only is the graphic novel still engaged in a struggle to legitimize its own critical reputation, but the aesthetic limitations imposed by Islam make the triangulation between text, image, and religion particularly difficult. What to do, for example, with Islamic anti-iconographic prohibitions of pictorial depictions. For centuries, Muslim artists operated on a completely different set of expectations that prioritized capturing the symbolic meaning of objects by emulating the perfection of divine vision. We see examples of that in miniature art, for example. Such transcendental pursuits essentially required self-effacement and a rejection of personal style and innovation, values difficult to accord with the Western emphasis on individuality and experimentation. Perhaps we are at a moment in which many Muslim artists are choosing to participate in this multimodal form precisely because they want to create a complex artistic statement that counters long-established Eurocentric traditions and replace them with thematic and aesthetic structures that emphasize global citizenry. Or perhaps the comics industry is having the final say. Create something marketable or find another genre. My second point is about the intended audience of these works. While there's a stable fan base for superhero narratives, Muslim feminist superheroes remain very rare. So the question is the Islamic feminist graphic novel aiming to convert Islamophobic sexists? Or is it trying to inspire Muslim women? Or is it aiming at both audiences at once? Muslim graphic narratives, I think, are ultimately engaged in a double or even triple critique. They not only expose the inner struggles of the Muslim communities, but they also shed light on the contradictions of nation-building practices in Muslim homelands. Simultaneously, far from idealizing the Western reader, the texts often reveal the reader's naivete about world affairs and cultural practices. Muslim comics is necessary right now. The complexity of their ambitions, the delicacy with which they must operate, the difficulty of oscillation between conformity and resistance. All of these challenges ultimately parallel the challenges experienced by Muslim women and by members of the Muslim diaspora around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your lecture. And there are some questions. Shall I put them in the chat box, or shall I read out to you?
If you could put them in a chat and also read them, because sometimes I lose the audio.
Okay, ma'am.
I can hear you very clearly right now, so let's give it a go. Let's give it a try.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, thank you. And the first question is by Sharbani Ghosh. Ma'am, my question is, what is more important in graphic novels, precise words or subtle graphic design?
I would say it is very difficult to prioritize text over the image or the other way around. I think there's a synergy, because sometimes there's a disconnect between the two as well. Like the panel that I have shown in Kahira, you see a statement and a statement being countered by the image, that they don't necessarily go in hand together, but there's like a very subtle political message there that allows the two of them to work together to make a statement. So I think in graphic novels, what is really important is to be able to process what is being visually, have aesthetics either complement or contradict the message that is being verbally conveyed.
Okay, ma'am. The next one is, this was asked by Ranjan Mehatra. Have these graphic novels been instrumental in bringing about a change in the mindset of the general American public?
I think yes, especially because, as I was showing in many public demonstrations, Kamala Khan emerged as the kind of the symbolic superhero that embraced diversity, inclusivity, and equality. And even though the creator of the series, Willow Wilson, talked about getting hate mail, essentially the critical reception of these Muslim superheroes have been nothing but positive. So except for a marginalized group of fans who did not like the story arc of introducing a Muslim superhero to the very well-established popular Ms. Marvel series, I think the overall reception has been very positive. And more importantly, Kamala Khan is now being taught in multicultural curriculum across the United States. Persepolis has become an iconic way of talking about Islam in high schools and in university curricula as well. So I think the coordinated effort to make these kinds of superhero narratives or Muslim narratives much more mainstream these days.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. And the next one is, can the Islamic feminist emerge in the Asian subcontinent in terms of graphic narratives in future?
Yes, and I think there are some examples coming from South Asia. I know one particular book called Sarah, the Diary of a Disobedient Pakistani Daughter, who talks about her daily chores and complains about them and is trying to bring forth this change about trying to redefine gender norms. And there's the Burqa Avenger, which is another animation that features a hijabi superhero. And I think the idea, what I find very interesting in most of the comics and Muslim narratives coming from South Asia is this sort of activism. It's not just about telling the stories of women, but raising consciousness, a larger consciousness, and to push people to usher in a different kind of activism that will bring forth change. So with that change in consciousness, I think, comes meaningful action. And I think there's definitely an effort, a coordinated effort to make that happen.
Okay, the next one is, has Islamic feminism brought any noteworthy change in the Western perceptions of Muslim women?
In the Western,
Has Islamic feminism brought any noteworthy change in the Western perceptions of Muslim women?
I think for Muslim women, Islamic feminism was something that was seen as an oxymoron, that you either have to be Muslim or you had to be a feminist. And I think with the newer theories about feminism, especially third world feminism, and what Margot Badran has done with Islamic feminism, like Leila Ahmed, Nawal al-Sadawi, what they're doing is to be able to go back to the Quran and say, hey, look, there is gender equality. What we have been doing as cultural practices are not necessarily things that are sanctioned by the Quran or the Islam itself. So I think what used to be seen as something that is completely contradictory has become a way to merge different kinds of discourses to give more voice and visibility to Muslim women in the West.
Okay, the next one is, if we use feminist approach to on to his co-mistress, does the meaning will be changed?
Could you repeat that question, please? I lost your voice.
Okay, ma'am. If we use feminist approach on to his co-mistress, does the meaning will be changed?
Will the meaning be changed? I think, well, what does the first part of the question, if we apply feminism to Western...
That was previous one, Western perceptions of Muslim women. There is a poem to his co-mistress, so she is saying that if we use feminist approach to this poem, then does the meaning will be changed?
Overlapping ideas of social justice, equality, and different kinds of injustices that we see in terms of human rights around the world. I think any kind of a text that allows you to bring up those kinds of ills of a society, it gives you a filter and a permission to be able to do those kinds of different kinds of readings in any kind of a text, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if I answered that question correctly.
Okay. Next one is, how far graphic portrayal of feminist issues changed the controversial ideologies?
The controversial ideologies. So,
yes, ideologies.
I think in a way, if we think about the history of Islam, for example, the traditions in Islam, the fact that many of these Muslim creators are actually using drawing as a way to bring change is itself a very radical ideological change. You know, in Islam, any kind of pictorial depiction is prohibited, that it is blasphemous to create any icons or to even draw in the portraiture style, because what happens is that you lose the symbolic meaning of objects if you try to individualize it too much. So the fact that, again, that Muslim creators are choosing this specific medium shows that there's a lot of ideological pushback about understanding Islam, what Islam means, Islam's relationship with aesthetics and aesthetic practices, and cultural change. So I would say, even without the message, the very fact that these people are drawing and using the graphic arts medium is an ideological pushback.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. This much for the day. And thank you very much on behalf of my college, on behalf of my department. I thank you because it's the very early morning in your country and in your place, and that you have wake up early and gave time for this lecture. Thank you very much.
It is my pleasure.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. And I also request I'm also informing all the participants that the feedback link will be right in the chat box tomorrow. Will be given tomorrow. Okay. Please do not send any mail to the organizers because it's very disturbing to receive unnecessary mails. Okay. The feedback link will be given tomorrow at the end of the webinar. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Have a nice day. And I am calling it a day. I wish that everyone should stay home, stay safe. Thank you.
Same. Stay safe. Thank you.